Good evening, and thank you for joining us for Guatemala in the 20th Century, a brief introduction, part of our spring series on Guatemalan history and culture. I'm Catherine Winters-Machad, and I am the program manager at the Cohen Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We're using Zoom webinar for this evening's presentation. Please put any questions for our presenter in the Q&A, which you'll find on your toolbar. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa DiGiovanni. Dr. DiGiovanni's interdisciplinary research and teaching centers on representations of war, dictatorial violence, and genocide in the 20th and 21st century Spain and Latin America. She deals with narrative, novels, short stories, graphic novels, and films, both fiction and documentary, that render visible the multiple traumas related to state repression and militaristic culture. Beyond her videographic scholarship work, Dr. DiGiovanni is also the author of Unsettling Nostalgia in Spain and Chile, Longing for Resistance in Literature and Film, numerous peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. Her work is published in both English and Spanish. Dr. DiGiovanni is bilingual and holds a split appointment in the KSC Departments of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, as well as the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures. Thank you, and this webinar is yours.
Hello, thank you for coming tonight. I'll be honest with you, I'm wearing these blue tinted glasses. These are my go-to glasses when if I'm too tired or if I've been crying. To be totally honest with you, I want to do this presentation. I've been excited about it, but about 3 hours ago, I heard that my father died. So it was really hard news, and I've been crying and therefore have my go-to blue glasses. So if I'm a little shaky, that might be why, but I'd like to move on, tonight with this and give this presentation. So thank you for coming. I'd like to give you a kind of a broad introduction first to Latin America, and then get into Guatemala, because the presentation that you're going to have in this series, it's very important to contextualize. Any genocide that you study, it's so important to contextualize historically, politically, to truly understand it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see? Can someone give me a yes, because I can only see my.
You're all set. Thank you.
So as you probably read in the materials, I went to Guatemala at a young 18 with my backpack. That was 1996. So Guatemala is a country that is very mountainous. There are 3 distinct regions in Guatemala. The highlands, you can see here, it's very mountainous. It borders Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. And those mountains, the Highland Mountains and volcanoes, those are the locations right here in the center. That's where most people live. This is Guatemala City in the center, and that is the capital. And then there's the coastal plains down here. And this is mostly tropical rainforest. And it's very, very green and rich in biodiversity. So the territory where Guatemala is located is part of Mesoamerica. The other word we use is Central America. And despite being a small country, Guatemala is exceptional in terms of biological diversity compared to other countries. And so this, I share this with my students in my Spanish classes. So these are in Spanish. So there are 720 species of birds, aves, 28 species of aquatic mammals, mamíferos, over 10,000 species of flora. These are fish, over 1,000 species of fish, land mammals, 200 species. You can just see amphibians and reptiles. The important cities include Guatemala City and Antigua. This is a very beautiful colonial city. It's very colorful. I spent some time in this city here. I didn't spend very much time in the capital. So with 18.12 million inhabitants, Guatemala is the most populous country in Central America. The indigenous civilizations were thriving when the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s. The Mayan civilization was the largest and the strongest, and it was already very highly developed in the arts and sciences and social organization. They had their own calendar that was represented in certain steps in the ruins. We can see that in these temples. This right here is Tikal. I had the opportunity to go there again when I was an 18-year-old, wide-eyed. The official language is Spanish, but there are many other languages of Mayan origin, such as Quiche and Cachiquel. And this really attests to cultural survival, resistance to colonization. You can see all of the different language groups in the map here. So today, the president is Bernardo Arévalo. He was just elected last year, and he's the son of leftist exiled parents. It was hard for him to get elected. He's the son of the ambassador for Israel. So he was actually born in Uruguay. When his parents could go back to Guatemala, his father became the ambassador of Guatemala in Israel. And then so he studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's multilingual. He was elected last year, and he is determined to reduce the massive inequalities and corruption that have plagued Guatemala for so long. He's particularly interested in reforms that involve agriculture, health, economy, infrastructure, education, labor, international relations, and of course, the challenges, ongoing corruption, and the violence that is rooted in conflict history and massive economic inequalities. So if we go back in time, we can understand the present more. So I'm going to give just a very brief introduction to the colonial past. So there are all over Latin America, you see these patterns of social domination, these hierarchies of power during the Spanish colonial period in Latin America. We're talking 400 years of colonial rule. The oligarchy used constructions of race to justify the abuse of human rights. So you have this caste system, you have the different categories that made you more white or brown and gave you different status, privilege, depending on that racial status. Okay, so I'm like going fast forward to independence. So like the US, it was around the same period, just a bit after. there were all of these movements for independence from Spain in Latin America. And this was Spain's massive loss of empire. But these hierarchies of power remained. We know that with these shifts, independence movements, racism and classism don't just go away like that. So hierarchies of power remained intact, even though the Spanish colonizers were no longer in power. So this was also the time around, well, really around 1900, this is around the time of the rise of US dominance in Latin America. So Spain loses a lot of control in Latin America, and the US begins to rise as a global power. So the hierarchies, and I'm wondering, so I really can only see my screen and I can't see anything in the chat. So maybe if Kate could give me just like some time warnings, that would be wonderful, so I could just stay on track with time.
Yeah, we're happy to do that. We'll keep an eye on
Okay.
it, Lisa. Thank you.
Okay. So these hierarchies of power and intersectionality in Latin America. So, oops. Okay. So these social systems founded on racism, classism, and sexism during the Spanish colonial rule endured long after independence. The legacy of classist, racist, and sexist, the legacy of that process of colonization persists even today. So the criollos were the social class in the hierarchy of the Spanish colonies. They were the locally born white Spaniards. So they were people of European descent, primarily Spanish ancestry. And so they became the wealthy landowners. So you can see here, these are the criollo people, and they became the politicians, the bankers, the landowners, etc. Okay, so those hierarchies of power remained after independence: race, gender, class, sexuality. The descendants of Spanish, Portuguese, and English held power and still hold power even today. The people who descend from slaves and subjugated indigenous populations still work for them. The dominance of US power in Latin America over the 20th century has entrenched power hierarchies instead of diminishing them. And all of these factors have led to divisions in political ideologies. So the US and Latin America, so as I said, at the turn of the century, Spain lost its standing as an imperial power in the world, and the US started to see itself as a global power, as it is today. This is a satirical cartoon here of the time. So who were the Latin American proponents of US investment? So it's not just that the US on its own wanted to or saw its place in Latin America. There were also Creole elites that wanted to work with US investors. Okay, so the Creole elites, as I said before, they were locally born landowners and industrialists, mostly of Spanish ancestry, who benefited from private enterprise, unregulated foreign investment, and the export of primary resources. Keep in mind that Latin America is so incredibly rich in natural resources. So oil, sugar, copper, iron, tin. When the colonizers first came, the primary goal was to extract gold, and then it was silver. And then as time went on, and still today, Latin America is still so rich in natural resources. So some of you are familiar with the Monroe Doctrine. That was 1823. It stated that efforts by European countries to interfere in the Americas would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring US intervention. And this was the time that Mexico claimed independence from Spain. And right after that, all of these other countries also gained independence. So this was the time that they were all gaining independence, and the US was becoming this kind of so-called protector of Latin America. So this provided conditions, though, for US dominance in the region. This was a defining moment for the US. Okay, so Central America and the Caribbean. What are some of the main resources? So we have a lot of natural resources, fruits, coffee. We still get coffee, sugar, cocoa beans, cacao, aluminum. How are we doing on time, Kate?
You're doing well, Lisa. So you still have just under 20 minutes. You can use a little bit more or less if you like, but still plenty of time.
So I have 20 minutes total left.
Yep, I'm right about that. Right, Catherine?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to show a little video. So the United Fruit Company is worth talking about here because it impacted Guatemala significantly. So the United Fruit Company was an American corporation formed in 1899, and it controlled large territories, mostly in Central America, the Caribbean, and the coast of Colombia and Ecuador. The proponents were Latin American elites, US and European investors, the proponents. The opponents were left-wing groups that sought economic and cultural independence from foreign investors, and some tried to implement agrarian reform. So you can see here, this is an older map. So I would like to, let's see here, yeah. So here's the leader that led a lot of these reform efforts. He was democratically elected. So this is democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz. So he was in office from 1951 to 1954. This was a really important time in Latin America and in Guatemala. So he was a major figure in the 10-year Guatemalan Revolution, which represented some of the few years of representative democracy in Guatemalan history. The landmark program of agrarian reform Arbenz enacted as president was very influential across Latin America. The US was concerned by the presence of communists in the Guatemalan government, and Arbenz was ousted in 1954. Remember, so he was left-leaning, he was he supported agrarian reform, but he was democratically elected. And of course, this was more of a threat to the United States and to others in the region, because if you could have a peaceful, democratically socialist government, then things could massively change for those investors that are greatly profiting. But if you could frame these reformers as radical and violent, anti-democratic, closer to fascists, then there's some kind of a justification for support of a military coup, right? But he was peaceful, democratic, and encouraged reform to eliminate this massive gap between the rich and the poor in Guatemala. So the US was concerned by the presence of communists, and so Arbenz was ousted. It was a Guatemalan coup d'etat engineered by the US and the Department of State and the CIA. So I'm going to show you a quick 3-minute video. Okay, no, I don't want to stop sharing, but what I do want to do, let's see. Okay, share. Okay, I want to, I think I have to unplace.
Okay, so tell me if you can hear this.
United Fruit Company will always
We
be
can hear
associated.
Lisa.
Okay,
United Fruit Company will always be associated with the kind of corporate dealings that make you wince. They perfected the art of divide and conquer among the poor inhabitants of Central America, ran their plantations like the pre-Civil War days in the United States, were the puppet masters behind several massacres, and even managed to convince the US government to overthrow the Guatemalan government for having the audacity to question its methods. In today's age of corporate greed and capitalism, we've become somewhat accustomed to shady business practices, but none come close to what United Fruit Company did. The United Fruit Company was formed in 1899 by Minor C. Keith and Andrew W. Preston from the merger of several smaller banana importing companies in Boston. Keith had already laid down substantial railroad tracks in Costa Rica, initially to aid in constructing a national railway. However, when the Costa Rican government defaulted on its loans, part of the deal that emerged was that Keith was given access to 800,000 acres of tax-free land along the railroad, plus a 99-year lease on operating the train route. Bananas were initially seen as a cheap food source for his workers, but he quickly realized that shipping them north into the United States was an untapped gold mine. The company quickly established a monopoly over the banana trade in several Central American countries by acquiring large swaths of land and controlling the entire supply chain, from cultivation and harvesting to transportation and marketing. This market dominance allowed them to set prices and control the process to best serve their own interests. Everything was going well for the United Fruit Company. By the early 20th century, it had become one of the largest employers in Central America, wielding enormous economic power. It bought shares in 14 competitors, meaning it controlled roughly 80% of the banana business in the early years of the century. However, you didn't achieve success like this without cutting plenty of corners, and in the case of the United Fruit Company, trampling over millions of people. The term banana republic to describe a politically and economically unstable country with an economy dependent upon the export of natural resources, often at the will of a somewhat omnipotent corporate power behind the scenes, originated from this very period. While the company certainly brought infrastructure and jobs to Central America, it also faced heavy criticism of its labor practices and its impact on local communities. The company controlled vast territories, dictating employment conditions, housing, healthcare, and education. Many argued that this control was exploitative and stunted the region's economic development, making it overly dependent on monoculture and foreign capital. It was not uncommon for the United Fruit Company to support friendly regimes to ensure a welcoming and profitable business environment. This often involved questionable tactics, including supporting coups and influencing governmental policies to benefit its agricultural interests. The most infamous instance of this was in Guatemala during the 1950s. The democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz enacted agrarian reform laws that threatened United Fruit's extensive land holdings. In response, the company lobbied the US government hard, painting Arbenz as a communist threat close to America's shores. This led to CIA involvement in a coup that ousted Arbenz and installed a more United Fruit Company-friendly regime. This campaign was led by US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, a rabidly anti-communist man who also just happened to be a partner at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, which had done extensive legal work for, you guessed it, the United Fruit Company.
okay.
The United Fruit Company will always be associated with...
All right. Let's see here.
Good, and you're still good on time, Lisa. You have about another 10 minutes or so. So if you're a little over or under that, that's perfectly fine too.
What's that?
You still have about another 10 minutes or so.
Okay. All right. So perfect. Actually, the timing's really good. So there's more video, but I just wanted to show the 3 minutes. Can everyone hear me and see the screen again?
Yep, everything looks great.
Okay, so that was Guatemala up, in the 1950s, right? So you can see that a lot was happening at that time. And then, so at the same time, there was the Cuban Revolution, which happened throughout the 50s. And in 1959, that's when the Cuban Revolution was successful. The rebels ousted the very repressive Batista regime, which was also very friendly with the United States. And this was incredibly impactful for the entire region. Okay, so, oops, let me go back. So the Cuban Revolution, can't be overstated, the impact that the Cuban Revolution had on all of Latin America. Many supported democratic revolution, while others supported armed revolution. So on the left, there was that big division, armed or democratic, which way to go. So you may know, some of you, I can't ask you, I guess, but so this is Che Guevara. Che Guevara supported armed revolution. He was from Argentina. He was a medicine. My goodness, this is my brain jumbling up. He studied medicine. He wanted to be a doctor. And after traveling around Latin America and seeing all of the inequalities, he decided that to make a bigger change, he couldn't just help heal 1 or 2 or 3 or even 500 people, that massive change had to happen. And so that's when he went into politics and revolutionary politics. And so he went to Mexico and met Fidel Castro, and then they fought the Cuban Revolution together. And later he was assassinated in Bolivia with the support of the CIA. So you have these Latin American icons of the Cold War. So some of this is in Spanish. Oh, because this was a slide that I used for my Spanish class. Okay, la izquierda, that means the left. Ernesto Che Guevara. So these are the icons. So he supported radical armed revolution. And then there's Salvador Allende, and he, like Arbenz, supported democratic revolution. And he also he supported socialism. So not communism, not full communism. So he believed in private property, whereas the communists of Cuba wanted to completely dismantle this kind of profit-driven system. So there were variations of this revolutionary movement of the left. And then you have la derecha, so that's the right wing. And so in the 70s, you have Richard Nixon really driving this ideological force, and Kissinger as the Secretary of State. Kissinger was very, very interested in Latin America. And this is Augusto Pinochet. So Pinochet was the dictator of Chile. And so I do a lot of research on the Southern Cone, Chile and Argentina. And so there was a military coup there there was a coup in 73, and that dictatorship lasted until 1990. Okay, so I'm almost finishing up here. So many of you have probably heard of the Contras. So the Contras they were the contra-revolucionarios. So the revolucionarios, they were the leftists, the revolutionaries like Che Guevara, they were the ones, and many of them were indigenous. And so that's why Guatemala is officially considered a genocide. You have these intersections of identity. You have these groups that were identified, they were indigenous, but they were leftists and revolutionaries. They wanted political change, and so many were massacred. So the United States, here you have Reagan in the 80s, stop communism in Central America. So you have the United States training military and supporting military dictatorships to fight these revolutionary sectors. Many are even students trying to make change in these different countries. Okay, so the Contras were right-wing groups backed and financed by the United States, and they were active from 1979 until the early 1990s in opposition to the socialist left in Latin America. Military reaction to revolution and the Cold War in Latin America. You know, the whole idea of the Cold War is actually a myth because it was cold. They say it's cold because there wasn't a war between the USSR and the United States, but it was actually quite hot in many parts of the world that are considered proxy wars. But many people died in the so-called Cold War. And many people died in Latin America. Hundreds of thousands of followers of leftist movements were repressed, killed, or forced into exile. Economies were transformed. The right-wing military governments adopted conservative policies that reduced social spending. So we could so in Guatemala, as I said, there's this intersection of identities. I'll put this here. The Guatemalan conflict, you have the authoritarian regime of Rios Montt, and it's considered an official genocide from 1982 to 1983. The conflict was much longer, though. It was 1960 to 1996. But the official campaign of genocide was this year. This was the worst, bloodiest part. And the US provided support for the military forces, and this was during Reagan. The US provided support for the military forces that became involved in the repression. So, as I said before, this is Rigoberta Menchú. If anyone is interested in reading a testimony, she has a very important testimony that's called I, Rigoberta Menchú. And she's an indigenous woman who gives her story of her experience of losing so many family members and during this period. Let me put this, where'd it go? Okay, so the genocide, so it targeted indigenous people, but the indigenous people, there were many that actually weren't even revolutionary, and they got caught in the middle. But they were seen as a threat because, you know, the majority did want change. They were living in poverty in the mountains, in that area that I showed you in the beginning, on the map. But what I wanted to say is, so in the case of Argentina and Chile, those in Argentina, 30,000 Argentinians were killed, eliminated in the name of national security by the right-wing military regime. That, according to the official definition of genocide, it's not considered a genocide. It's a politicide because it's a political group. But going on Raphael Lemkin's definition, that would be considered a genocide as well. But one particular feature of the Guatemalan genocide is that you have the intersection of politics and you have this indigenous, this racial factor. It was a targeted group. So how am I on time?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Is that a good
Yes.
stopping place, Lisa?
Yeah, that's a good stopping place for me.
That was great. I mean, you covered so much in your presentation portion, and I know Catherine's been collecting some questions from the audience. So if it's okay, I think she might just share a couple of those questions with you.
Sure.
Great, thank you.
Of course. So just as a reminder to the audience, also, you can continue to add questions in the Q&A. It should appear on your bottom tool button, and we'll try to add those in if we have time. So the first question was, are the disappeared counted in the death count of the genocide in Guatemala?
Yes, that's a good question. So there's been so much done, fortunately. And this is the great work of so many human rights activists. And you're going to hear, this is the great thing, what the Cohen Center is doing. Whoever asked that, you have to go to this next presentation, because that is exactly what is going to be talked about. All of that. Okay. So that's what I'm going to say. So we should go to you have to go to that talk. All of the details will be at that talk.
So thank you for that great plug for our Genocide Awareness Lecture that's happening in April. But to go on with the questions, so first, just a comment, someone wanted to let you know that the political cartoons and the other images that you shared were very powerful. So in terms of this occurring in Latin America, how was the United States and these corporations able to exercise so much influence over all of these countries almost simultaneously?
How was the United States able to do this? Money. So, well, as I said before, so you have these remaining hierarchies of power, right? So there was already a system in place that allowed the United States, the economic elites in the US, right? Actually, there are a few parts to this that I'll say. There was a system in place in Latin America that facilitated these relationships to create this system of domination, right? So there were already these hierarchies in power that were the part of the legacy of colonial rule. Okay, so there's that. You have these economic elites. Now, those economic elites are like this with the political elites. And the political elites, if the political elites have control over the military, you're done. The military is, and the United States, the military in the United States, throughout the 20th century, our military has become so enormous and advanced. The power of the United States has grown so much. And so the investment our investment in their militaries, so we train their militaries, and those militaries work for these governments, because they're the military, and they're serving these military governments, and the military governments are taking all of these bribes from the political elites that are also working, hand in hand with all of these industries. And so you see all of these, it's kind of like the 1% is just taking all. And so that's how this is happening. The military is a very key factor here. So this is a very interesting side note. Costa Rica in I think it was 1941, 42, Costa Rica is the only country that abolished their military, okay? And what happened? It was very, very smart of the president. Figueras was the president of the time, and he knew that he knew this process, that corrupt governments come to power, they rule the military, and those who rule the military have the power over civilians because civilians don't have the arms to fight back. And so they abolished their military, and Costa Rica, I don't want to idealize, it's not heaven, it's not a utopia, but I've been there myself. I know about Costa Rican history, and they, since then, are the only country in the entire region that has not had a military dictatorship. They have been the most stable country in the region. They're one of the most successful countries. I mean, it's a tourist spot. Everyone loves Costa Rica. They don't have a military. And they invest it in healthcare. They invest that money that would have gone to the military in healthcare and education. Now, you might say, wow, well, how do they do that? They do have very strong diplomatic relations. So that's an important piece. And they do have like these kind of peacekeeping, so they do defend their borders. So anyways.
So as a follow-up to that, we had a question that was kind of asking about the region and specifically El Salvador. So in addition to the violence and political turmoil that played out in Guatemala affecting its neighbors, would you say that it's fair to say that the militaries on the ground in these other countries also play into kind of continued difficulties in the region? Your example of Costa Rica seems to suggest that if they invested in other infrastructure, they might not have.
Yes. That's a great question. And it's a fantastic question. To add to that, I want to say something. So you have this civil war. Guatemala was not the only one with a civil war, unrest, genocide, or politicide in that region. I mean, it's all throughout. So when you think of, in genocide studies, we talk about upstream, midstream, downstream prevention, right? So in all of these cases, military regimes, right? Military regimes carried out these genocides in every single case. And so you have a population of military veterans, and let's face it, some of these, there was conscription, which is obligatory military service. Some of these soldiers didn't want to commit some of these crimes, okay? So that's a very interesting piece too. So when we talk about downstream prevention, we need to think about questions of masculinity and reintegration of soldiers into society, because many of these soldiers go into society and they become drug lords and they become criminals because that's like the only thing they know how to do. And so reintegration of soldiers is so
important in downstream prevention, and it really has not been fully addressed. And what we're seeing today in Latin America, a lot of crime and a lot of drugs, a lot of gangs. It in many ways is the legacy, the bad legacy of what happened in the 80s. And that legacy, all that stuff is not disconnected from the United States.
Thank you so much. It is time to wrap up, but first I want to say thank you again, Lisa. It was a great presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this presentation today. For those of you whose questions weren't answered, please remember this is the first event in our series on Guatemala. We are having, on Monday, March 24th, we'll be welcoming Otila Lux de Coti, a pioneering leader in Indigenous peoples and women's rights in Guatemala and internationally, for the webinar International Indigenous Peoples and Women's Rights in Guatemala. If you come to that, hopefully you'll see Lisa again. She'll be our moderator for that event. And then on Thursday, March 27th, the El Chaponcito food truck will be coming to Keene State College for a taste of Guatemala at lunchtime, noon. The series will conclude with our 2025 Genocide Awareness Lectures, Friends Who Disappear, documenting the Guatemalan genocide and forced disappearance, on Wednesday, April 2nd. You can register for the Genocide Awareness Lecture and find details about all of these events on our website, keene.edu/CIHGS, and we hope that you have a great evening. Thank you again for everyone who attended.